When we talk about the great armies of the ancient world, our attention usually focuses on the civilized powers, Rome, Greece, and Persia. Their opponents, especially the so-called barbarians, often remain in the shadows or are depicted in a caricatured way as rough, poorly organized mobs, capable of winning only through cunning ambushes or reckless charges. This image has become firmly rooted in popular culture, but the reality was much more complex. The Germanic tribes that faced the might of the Roman Empire were not just disorganized hordes, but warlike societies with their own traditions, tactics, and art of warfare. So, my friends, you're watching Amazing History, and in this video, I will tell you about one of Rome's most formidable opponents, Germania, the Germanic warriors who emerged from the dark forests beyond the Rhine to challenge the empire. Before I continue, please don't forget to support the channel through sponsorship on YouTube or Patreon. We would also appreciate your likes, subscriptions, and of course your kind comments. Let's get started with the topic of this episode. The origins of the Germanic tribes go back centuries. Their ethnogenesis was complex and included migrations of Indo-Europeans mixing with Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age cultures, and possibly some Finno-Ugric peoples. By the first millennium BC, a distinctive military culture had formed in the territory of modern Germany, Denmark, and southern Scandinavia, which will become a key topic of our research. However, the Germanic peoples were not a single nation. They were a warlike conglomerate of tribes with different dialects, traditions, and levels of social development. The term Germanic is largely conventional and was used by Roman and Greek authors as a convenient classification. These peoples spoke related languages, but their grouping into a single category was more of an external observation than a real ethnic identity. To make sense of this confusion, it's important to set aside modern national concepts. National identities or personalities as we understand them today simply did not exist back then. The world of the Germanic peoples was built not on administrative borders, but on a complex network of social ties that started with the family and expanded to larger communities. Over time, the unification of individual families led to the formation of clans, and the collection of clans formed tribes. Their numbers varied, but generally ranged from several thousand to tens of thousands of people. A tribe could be ruled by a chief, but most often decisions were made by a council of nobles. The influence of the chief was based not so much on strength as on the ability to negotiate, attract supporters, and successfully wage wars. The economy of the Germanic peoples remained predominantly agrarian. They practiced agriculture and animal husbandry, and extracted iron, salt, timber, and peat. In the southern regions, closer to Gaul, there were fortified settlements resembling Celtic oppida. However, by the 2nd century BC, many of them had fallen into decline, probably due to social upheavals, pressure from waves of migration, and changes in trade routes. Overall, the Germanic peoples were relatively dispersed, and the population density of their territory remained low. Germanic chieftains did not have absolute power and were highly dependent on the support of their warriors. They could not simply order an army to be assembled. Instead, their power rested on personal ties. Chieftains attracted warriors by promising them spoils, glory, and protection. This created a kind of social contract, in which the military and political hierarchy was constantly changing, and the status of leaders depended on their success in battle and their ability to distribute rewards. Now let's look at those who responded to the call to battle. Their equipment depended on their social status and material resources. The basic clothing consisted of a long-sleeved tunic made of wool and linen, trousers tied at the ankles, and a belt at the waist. On top of this, they wore a thick woolen cloak, which could be used as a blanket in field conditions. For most warriors, this was the extent of their protective gear. The main reason was the relative poverty of the average peasant warrior, as well as the difference in the availability of iron. Tacitus, for example, points out that iron was in limited supply, but archaeological findings indicate the opposite. For example, in one of the workshops on the territory of modern Poland, more than 150 smelting furnaces were discovered, which indicates a well-developed metallurgical industry. High-quality equipment was mainly available to the nobility and their retinue. Aristocrats and their bodyguards could afford chainmail armor, which provided good protection. Scale armor was also found, although it was more characteristic of Eastern tribes. As for head protection, most ordinary warriors either went without helmets or wore simple hats made of fur or leather. Such a display of an uncovered head could serve as a sign of bravery and allowed them to show off elaborate hairstyles, such as the famous Suebian knot. However, noble warriors sometimes had more elaborate helmets. Plutarch, describing the Germanic cavalry during the Cimbrian War, mentioned helmets with huge plumes, stylized as the jaws of wild beasts and monsters. The most common piece of protective equipment was the shield. It was relatively inexpensive, which made it accessible even to poor warriors. Shields varied in shape. There were round, oval, rectangular, and hexagonal variants. The basic structure was made of wood. They were reinforced with a metal rim and a central boss. Some shields were equipped with spikes, which suggests they could be used as melee weapons. Shields also had important symbolic significance. Their colors and ornaments could indicate belonging to a particular tribe or unit. For example, Plutarch mentions that the Germanic cavalry in the Cimbrian War used white shields, and the Hari tribe painted their shields and bodies black to intimidate their opponents. The main weapon of the Germanic people was the spear. It was not only effective in battle but also had important ritual significance. Upon reaching adulthood, a young man received a spear and a shield, which symbolized his right to participate in tribal assemblies. The main type of spear was a standard throwing or thrusting weapon. But there were also versatile light spears that could be used both in close and long-range combat. Swords were much less common. According to estimates, in the 1st century AD, only 1 in 10 warriors had one, but by the 3rd century, every 4th warrior carried a sword. This is due to the growth in craft production and increased contact with the classical world. Many Germanic people acquired swords from Roman traders. As confirmed by archaeological findings, the long spada was especially popular. But later, Rome imposed bans on selling weapons to the barbarians, which reduced supplies. In addition to spears and swords, the Germanic people used other types of weapons. For close combat, battle axes, maces, and long knives were used, while for range combat, bows and slings were employed. Now that we have examined the weapons of the Germanic warriors in detail, we can move on to analyzing their military organization. Since the Germanic peoples did not have a permanent professional army, military campaigns were irregular and based on a system of social levies. At the top of this system stood the tribal chiefs and the most influential leaders. They could act together or choose a single commander-in-chief, who would then call upon his supporters. This process happened in a chain. The tribal chiefs would turn to the clan leaders, they would turn to the local leaders, and then the bulk of the warriors would be mobilized. The first to respond to the call were the chiefs' retinues. These warriors had the best equipment, often received as rewards, and were the closest to professional troops. However, their numbers remained relatively small. The majority of the army consisted of commoners who stood at the lowest levels of the social hierarchy. These units were formed based on family, clan, and territorial ties, which made the Germanic armies a conglomerate of disparate groups. In the absence of a fixed structure, the leaders faced the challenge of organizing them effectively. One example of such organization can be seen in the Battle of 58 BC, when the Suebi leader Ariovistus divided his army into 7 units according to the number of tribes involved. It is not known for certain who exactly commanded these units, but it is likely that the leaders were chosen at a general assembly of warriors. Despite the chaotic nature of Germanic armies, we have evidence of a certain degree of standardization. One such element was the so-called hundred, a unit made up of carefully selected warriors representing different districts of the tribe. The hundreds played a key role, maintaining formation and providing cover for the cavalry. These elite infantry units impressed Julius Caesar during his Gallic campaigns. Over time, this system became the foundation of the Germanic military organization, especially as they came into contact with Rome. An example of the evolution of Germanic armies was the wars of the 1st century AD, when Arminius led a large-scale uprising against the Romans. It was at that time that we first see the Germanic peoples developing a more complex military structure. The historian Tacitus especially singled out the Chatti tribe, emphasizing their organization and discipline. Over time, the Germanic peoples became more and more organized as they interacted more closely with the Roman military system. Many served in the Roman legions, adopting their tactics and combat experience. By the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Germanic tribal leaders had already accumulated enough knowledge and military resources to take on the role of new rulers of the former Roman provinces. Next, let's move on to discussing the training of Germanic warriors, which was significantly different from more modern defense systems. There are few sources on this topic, and it seems that the Germanic peoples did not have a clear institutional system of military training. However, there was no need for this. Combat skills are acquired naturally, since Germanic society was warlike by its very nature. Hunting, intertribal skirmishes, raids, and full-scale wars were common occurrences, shaping the Germanic people into warriors, a warrior mentality from an early age. The training of young men took place mainly within the family circle. Fathers, uncles, and older brothers passed on their combat experience to the next generations. In addition, these skills were passed on through participation in intertribal conflicts and other military actions. The foundation of training consisted of physical conditioning, running, wrestling, carrying heavy loads, and mastering weapons, especially the spear and shield. Young warriors were also probably introduced to formation tactics, such as the shield wall, although collective training at the level of large units was rare. Despite the emphasis on individual training during peacetime, this did not mean the absence of systematic instruction. Some chieftains recognized the importance of discipline and organized military exercises. For example, commanders like Maroboduus paid attention to regular training, which allowed them to raise the level of combat readiness of their troops, bringing it closer to that of the Romans. As with the organization of the army, the training methods of the Germanic peoples underwent significant changes under the influence of contact with Rome. Many Germanic warriors who served in the Roman army adopted tactical techniques and discipline, which over time changed their approach to warfare. Now let's move on to discussing the tactics of the Germanic armies. The common idea of the Germanic peoples as warriors who charged into battle without a clear plan goes back to ancient sources. Authors from the civilized world often portrayed the barbarians as savages who relied on fury and onslaught, but lost their fighting spirit at the first setback. Although this view is simplistic and largely distorted, it still reflects some key features of Germanic tactics. The tactical approaches of the Germanic peoples were largely connected to the social organization of their army. Since the army was assembled from mobilized commoners, it could not remain in the field for long. Peasants and herders could not afford to leave their farms for long. This led to a desire for a quick resolution of the conflict. The warriors sought a decisive victory as quickly as possible. However, this dynamic was characteristic not only of the Germanic peoples, but also of many other ancient armies, which also lacked the resources for long campaigns. The Germanic tribes were characterized by the lack of a clear logistical structure, which affected their combat capabilities. Armies often could not remain in the field for long periods, and the primitive supply system made it difficult to carry out more complex maneuvers. As a result, most operations were fairly simple, and attempts to carry out more complex actions sometimes ended in failure when elements of the army, for example, broke formation by not maintaining order. Nevertheless, such problems were not unique to the Germanic peoples, but were part of the broader difficulties faced by many tribes and peoples of that time. So, what did the tactics of a typical Germanic warrior unit look like on the battlefield? Usually it was divided into several phases, each with its own characteristics. At the first stage, the armies took their positions on the battlefield. The units lined up around their standards, wooden poles with colored fabrics and tribal insignia. Losing a standard was considered a serious insult to the entire tribe, and guarding it was the most important task. During deployment, the army formed a cohesive battle line where many units became a single front. The chiefs and their retinues often took up forward positions. The flanks of the army were protected by cavalry, auxiliary troops, or were positioned in difficult terrain. In the second stage, the armies assessed each other's strength. This process could include duels between champions or small skirmishes. However, the key element was the display of strength, an integral part of Germanic tactics. The warriors used noise to create an impression of their army's might and to demonstrate confidence. The furious roar, shouts, and sounds of battle instruments became a kind of psychological weapon, putting the enemy under intense pressure. The practice of barditus, widely used by the Germanic tribes, was especially well known. As Tacitus writes, barditus began with a low, booming sound that the warriors created by pressing their shields to their mouths to amplify the vibration. This sound would grow, becoming louder and reaching a deafening crescendo, which had an intimidating effect on the enemy. Those who did not retreat under this pressure faced the next phase, an attack. At the peak of the barditus, when the noise reached its maximum, the Germanic units launched a decisive offensive along the entire front. Cinema often portrays such an attack as chaotic and disorderly, but this doesn't reflect reality. The Germanic armies, despite their relatively simple organization, understood well the importance of maintaining formation. The greatest crime for a warrior was to throw away his shield, which emphasized the importance of fighting as part of a unit whose members protected one another. This indicates the presence of organized tactics even within a tribal army. One of the most striking examples of tactical organization is the use of wedges. Such formations helped concentrate efforts and increase the chances of breaking through. The wedges of the Germanic troops consisted of several dozen or even hundreds of people. Unlike the traditional linear advance, which stretched along the width of the line, the wedge concentrated forces at a specific point where the attack unfolded most decisively. This also fit well with the social structure of the army, where the chiefs and their heavily armed retinues could take position at the tip of the wedge, while the rest of the warriors were positioned behind them. Germanic warriors were generally expected to protect their chiefs, which boosted the army's determination and fighting spirit. As soon as the tip of the wedge entered the battle, the rest of the army eagerly followed. However, this formation had its drawbacks. If the attack was unsuccessful, the wedge with its forward part could be poorly prepared for an organized retreat. This problem was partially solved later, when the Germanic tribes began to adopt Roman tactical doctrine, including the use of reserves. The Germanic tribes are often associated with the art of ambush warfare, but this view requires clarification. Indeed, in a number of cases, they successfully used surprise attack tactics, especially against Roman armies. But they did this more out of necessity rather than because of some innate tendency. As history shows, guerrilla warfare and asymmetric methods of conducting hostilities become the main choice when facing an enemy with numerical or technological superiority. The Germanic peoples were good at this, but by no means unique. We have examples of both successful ambushes and cases where their own forces fell victim to enemy traps. Ultimately, hit-and-run tactics were contrary to the Germanic code of warfare. As soon as the tribes gained confidence in their strength, they consistently preferred traditional battles in open combat. Telling the whole story, the history of Germanic warriors, in a single video is difficult, so we'll have to speak in general terms, giving a few specific examples. The main problem is that the Germanic peoples did not leave behind their own written sources. Most of the information about them comes from the Romans and Greeks, and therefore it is fragmentary and often biased. The first reliable information about the Germanic armies dates back to the end of the 2nd century BC, when several tribes from the north became involved in the Roman sphere of influence. These early encounters showed that the Germanic peoples could be formidable opponents. In 105 BC, at the Battle of Arausio, the Cimbri and the Teutons destroyed a Roman army of about 80,000 men, inflicting on the Republic its heaviest defeat since the Battle of Cannae. Nevertheless, a few years later, Gaius Marius carried out military reforms and reorganized the legions, which allowed Rome to take revenge and stop the invasion. In the 1st century BC, the Germanic tribes once again clashed with Rome in Gaul. In 58 BC, Julius Caesar fought against the Suebi leader Ariovistus in the Battle of the Vosges. Although the Germanic tribes fiercely resisted, the Romans turned the course of the fighting in their favor by skillfully using their reserves. Later, Caesar even conducted a brief campaign on Germanic territory, crossing the Rhine. However, this was more a demonstration of strength than a real attempt at conquest. The next major clash occurred in 16 BC when Germanic tribes invaded Roman Gaul and defeated the Roman legions. In response, Augustus sent significant forces, beginning a years-long struggle for control of the region. During these campaigns, there were many battles, including the famous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where the Germans under the command of Arminius destroyed 3 Roman legions. After this disaster, Rome abandoned its plans for the complete conquest of Germania and focused on strengthening the border along the Rhine. Thereafter, the imperial armies preferred to carry out local punitive expeditions to maintain control over the region. The effectiveness of the Romans in fighting the Germans was largely due to their superior organization, discipline, and support from heavy cavalry. However, over time, the balance of power began to change. More and more Germans served in the Roman army, adopting the military tactics and discipline of the legions. From the 4th century AD, the migration period began, during which Germanic tribes increasingly crossed the borders of the empire. Ultimately, this process led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. The history of Germanic warriors is rich and complex. I hope this overview has helped you to dispel common myths and show that the Germanic people were not just savages, but sophisticated and adaptable warriors whose evolution played a key role in changing the art of war in late antiquity. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.